Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very special moment in the TBA's history. 100 years, the launch of the Centenary book, and a very special guest, and he is a special guest, is Rob Kasky. I have the privilege of introducing Rob Kasky. He joins us fresh from a lengthy round trip into the Antarctica, then Cape Horn to Cape Town, via South Georgia and Tristan da Cunha, where he regaled guests with stories of Shackleton, Wild, Joyce, and Macklin. Storytelling may seem like an old-fashioned tool today, and it is. That's exactly what makes it so powerful. Life happens in the narratives we tell one another. A story can go where quantitative analysis is denied admission into our hearts. Data can persuade people, but it does not inspire them to act. To do that, you need to wrap your vision in a story that fires the imagination and stirs the soul. Rob Kasky's storytelling began in earnest in 2001 on the famous Anglo-Zulu War battlefields, mentored by world-renowned raconteur David Rattray. Researching and sharing human dramas has taken him to the Antarctic, the Arctic, and regularly to the battlefields. Beautifully crafted stories weave their way into our souls and connect us with history. The TBA celebrates 100 years of breeding in South Africa with the commemorative coffee table book, which I just held up a moment ago. We thank our thoroughbred breeders, without whom this book would not have content. And our grateful thanks and appreciation to our generous sponsors for this event, Gold Circle, the Cape Breeders Club, the National Horse Racing Authority, and the Equine Group. And ladies and gentlemen, on that note, please give a warm welcome to Rob Kasky.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm hoping you can all hear me. I'm going to talk considerably slower than the auctioneers do. It's a special skill that I've never mastered. And I asked Heather where I was going to speak from when I arrived today, and she said, no, you're going to speak from the auctioneer's box. So I want to tell you that this is very new for me. I've never spoken from a place like this before, with a big pit in front of me and the audience up in the clouds on the same level. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. But I was asked to do a little talk tonight to really celebrate the 100 years of the Thoroughbred Breeders Association and the launch of this magnificent book, which I really hope you're going to take an opportunity to get a copy of and look through. It has been beautifully, beautifully put together. People have worked very hard on it, including Miss Lowe, Robin Lowe, Heather Morkill, Duncan and others, and it really is a most magnificent presentation. You know, it was Winston Churchill who said that there's something about the outside of a horse that is very, very good for the inside of a man or a woman. And I think, ironically, that really is why we're all here. We love horses, not just race horses, thoroughbred horses, working horses, draft horses. We collectively love horses. And the centenary of the TBA came about in 2020. It was launched in 1920. And of course, with COVID, there was very little that could be done by way of a celebration. So I want to look in a very, very potted fashion at the last 100 years of the TBA, if I may. So let's consider those early years of the Dutch East India Company establishing themselves at the Cape, having those little Timor ponies that came from Timor that are very similar to the Basuto ponies today, and their bloodlines live on. And then eventually the Caper horses that were slightly bigger and did considerably better as riding horses. But what really changed in terms of thoroughbred breeding in this country was the year 1814, when Lord Charles Somerset became governor of the Cape. He was very keen on horses, very keen on thoroughbreds, and began to bring very good thoroughbred horses into the Cape Colony. Now that time is seminal in South African history, because 1815 is the year that explosion took place in Indonesia called Tambora. Most guests that I speak to are unaware of this mighty volcanic explosion, Tambora, in Indonesia in 1815. And Tambora spewed square kilometers of ash cloud into the atmosphere that drifted off to the west, causing major climate change all over the eastern seaboard of Africa, Europe, parts of Asia, and indeed as far as America. There was a famine in China. Children died walking barefoot home from school. And indeed, here in South Africa, there were incredible depredations as a result of Tambora. Now, 1816, the following year, is the year that Shaka became paramount chief of the Zulu people. And that also is the beginning of what we call the Mfecane, the crushing in South Africa. And everybody holds Shaka as being at the epicenter of the Mfecane, and I don't believe it is valid or justified to do so. I think the Mfecane had far more to do with the after effects of Tambora and less to do with Shaka. What is interesting too is that 1816 in Europe was considered the year of no oats. And up to that point, they used horses mainly for transport. Oats were the principal food of horses. And because there was a shortage of oats, there was tremendous advance in the development of the bicycle in 1816. So for those of you interested in cycling, you may be very interested to note that it was a shortage of oats that really promulgated great advances in the bicycle come the year 1816. And it was at that time that Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. You will recall that the British had seized the Dutch from the Cape in 1795, largely to stop it falling into French hands during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, I thought for a little bit of background, I'd give you that. It's interesting to note that those early days of breeding in the Cape were dominated by people like the Van Breda's, the Oosthuizens, and so forth. And then there was a remarkable J.F. Kirsten who bred horses in the Cape, and he married the widow of a man called Cornelius Melk. And Melk is an old Cape name. They own the Murati wine estate, and the Melks came out in 1685 on account of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, religious persecution in Europe that sent a lot of Europeans moving all over the world. We are very pleased for the French Huguenots who came out with their viticulture and their knowledge of wine, who established these incredible wine estates in the Cape. And indeed, Murati has been in the hands of the Melk family since 1685, which I think is a remarkable achievement. And these sales, as we are enjoying here today, and I believe today has been a very good sale, and hallelujah for that after the difficult years this industry has faced, are really about selling hopes and dreams. And I'm hoping that those of you who've sold horses today and bought horses are going to have hopes and dreams exceeded by these animals in the days ahead. But isn't it wonderful how the Karoo, with its climate and its substrate, which is so well suited to sheep, with the right ratio of protein, calcium, and phosphorus in its soils, is also good for the production of racehorses. And those early studs began in the Colesberg, Middelburg, Craddock triangle, and they did incredible work following the wool boom. 1870s, Industrial Revolution, everyone needed wool. And the people who made a lot of money in wool invariably became stud breeders. The horse racing and the horse breeding tends to follow new wealth, and it's wonderful to consider that those early studs in the Karoo followed the wool boom. I'm also very interested in the fact that in South Africa at the time, we had in 1867 a man walking along a little watercourse near Hopetown, which was in Griqualand. And he discovered a shiny stone, which he picked up. It turned out to be the precursor of the greatest pipe of diamonds the world will ever know. Kimberlite diamonds, hence the name Kimberley. For the British, Griqualand was part of the Orange Free State, which they found mildly inconvenient. So they quickly held a commission in the Cape called the Keat Commission and moved the border of the Cape to include the diamond fields. And the Free State were spared the issues of a burgeoning mining town within their territory, but given an insatiable demand for everything they could produce just over the border. And then in 1873 followed the discovery of gold at Pilgrim's Rest, long before that great discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886. Now, the railway was built between PE and Kimberley in 1885, and wealthy folks were able to move easily between Port Elizabeth and Kimberley for the horse racing. The following year, George Harrison discovered gold on the Witwatersrand, and with that, horse racing got a tremendous boost in terms of the men who would soon be what we call the landlords in this country. The landlords, of course, made a fortune on the diamond fields of Kimberley and on the gold fields of the Witwatersrand, and with it put a huge amount of money into thoroughbred horse breeding and horse racing in this country. I've always enjoyed the fact that Charles Southey was the son of Sir Richard Southey. He was a pioneer 1820 settler who bred sheep in the Karoo. The horse racing fraternity in the Cape had been enormously swelled by the support of more than 4,000 settlers who fled the conditions in the Eastern Cape to take their chances in the greater Cape Town area. A lot of the early studs were focused around Cape Town, but many of these folks were rather economic regarding the truth about their agricultural prowess. They got cheap ticket from England out to the Eastern Cape as the 1820 settlers, and very quickly realized that in that seed belt it was impossible to earn a living. And with it, South Africa's national sport began. Everyone thinks it's rugby. I've always maintained our national sport is cattle rustling. And they began to rustle cattle from the classes, and the classes in turn rustled cattle back. And then British soldiers had to come out to support the settler claims in those areas. Many of the settlers threw their hands in the air and moved to Cape Town and became supporters of the gambling and the betting and the watching of horse racing. Now, the Southey descendants still breed horses down in the Karoo. I've been to their farm, Mount Malseta at Skumbi. There was the fantastic Kalmstock stud just over the road, not all that far from Middelburg. And I love the story that Charles Southey imported a wonderful horse called Wackham, who did very well in this country as a great sire. And then he imported a horse called Pearl Diver. Now, Pearl Diver, I'm told, as many of these stallions can be, could be rather recalcitrant. And he was housed on the deck of the ship coming out here on the Newham Castle in a big box on the deck. And some of the guests who knew nothing about horses and trying to be funny would often approach on hand and knee right to below the front of his stall and then leap up shouting in his face, which I don't think really engenders good relationships with a racehorse. And one day, one of the guests did so with a straw hat on his head, and Pearl Diver promptly grabbed the straw hat and ate it. Luckily, to no ill effect, but the game soon stopped about giving Pearl Diver a fright in the morning. Well, at Kalmstock, one of the grooms struck Southey's trainer, at the time considered a very serious crime, and he was imprisoned for a month. When he emerged from prison, he got work on a neighboring farm and immediately got into collusion with the grooms on Southey's Kalmstock stud. And Pearl Diver was a strange horse in that he battled to digest and eat whole oats. He liked them crushed or rolled oats. And the grooms, in collusion with the groom who was out of prison, fed him whole oats. By the time Charles Southey became aware of the situation, his horse was so gravely ill he died. They then went on to mix a dreadful dip which contains large amounts of arsenic in the water. They poisoned another champion sire in Kalmstock stock, and 10 of his mares, a more than 10,000 pound loss at the turn of the last century. Yet Charles Southey continued to breed horses extremely well and make a great success of breeding in that part of the world. I love the fact, too, that not far away at Stormfontein near Colesberg was Alex Robertson, who married into an old Cape family, and he bred South Africa's first Triple Crown winner, Colesberg, 1917. And isn't it wonderful that during the Anglo-Boer War, the youngest Robertson stayed at home with Mrs. Robertson to look after the stud and the horses, while Mr. Robertson and the older boys went off to war. And one day the Boers arrived, and they claimed 4 stallions and 30 mares and rode off with them, literally commandeered them. And I love the fact that the following day a Boer general arrived back on the farm with all the horses in tow, because he had got wind that some belonged to the famous and very wealthy Abe Bailey. And he certainly didn't want to incur the wrath of Abe Bailey, and the horses were returned to the farm. Well, you will also know that the Joel brothers feature prominently in this thoroughbred racing history. Solly, Joel, and Wolf. Wolf was murdered in 1898. They were nephews of Barney Badato. Barney Badato, in a fit of depression, threw himself overboard on a ship in 1897 and drowned. And Jack ended up being charged with illicit diamond buying. I think there was a lot of this going on at the time in the diamond boom. And he jumped bail and went off to England, where he established the Childeck Bury stud, very successful breeder. And his brother Solly, too, was a very successful breeder in England. Now, because we all love horses and not necessarily solely racehorses, I want to tell you a little story that some of you may know, some of you may not know. But the last Napoleon, effectively Napoleon IV, came to his end in this country on the 1st of June of 1879. Napoleon III, you may remember, was exiled from France after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And in 1873, when he, his wife, the Empress Eugenie, and the young son, Louis Jean-Joseph Napoleon, were being given succor and cover by Queen Victoria in England, Napoleon III died in 1873. His son went on to attend Woolwich, became an artillery officer, but as a Frenchman couldn't wear a commission. And then news broke in England of the battles of St. Luana and Rorke's Drift. And there were great hives of activity as regiments were trying to mount reinforcements to come out to South Africa to quell the Zulus forever. And Louis Jean-Joseph really wanted to come. Benjamin Disraeli, who was at the time the Prime Minister, refused, feeling it was too dangerous. But Louis had powerful aides. His mother went to Queen Victoria. She went to the Duke of Cambridge. She was Chief of General Staff. And eventually they implored on Disraeli to allow this young French Prince Imperial to come out to South Africa as a non-rank-bearing observer and was to be exposed to no danger. Well, in Durban, he bought a horse called Percy from a colonial called Merrick Bennett. And Percy must have had some thoroughbred in him because he was wont to buck and rear. But young Napoleon was a very good horse rider, 23 years of age. And he often used to gallop down the street and he would cut potatoes and tomatoes flung at him from bystanders with his great-uncle's sword. Good-looking man, French accent. He set many young female hearts aflutter. And he ended up on the front with Lord Chelmsford's 2nd Division invading Zululand. And on the 16th of May of 1879, he was out on patrol with Red Visbola, who was an incredibly brave man in this country. And he took off after some Zulus on his horse with his sword. Well, Buller was horrified and said that he was definitely going to get himself killed. And Lord Chelmsford had to issue additional instructions regarding his safekeeping. And 2 weeks later, the entire 2nd Division, 5,000 men, were due to move from Kopialeon down to Etelezeni Hill through an area near Ngutu in northern KwaZulu-Natal, which was considered to be Zulu-free. The patrol only comprised 11 men. It was in the hand of a captain called Brenton Jaleel Carey, and they wanted to stop late morning for coffee. 1st of June, it was a Sunday, and Louis wrestled with Carey saying, let's go down to that Zulu village down in the valley, and we'll have coffee down there where we can break lats out of the roof of the huts to make our fire. Now, I think it's incredibly inflammatory and antagonistic to destroy Zulu homesteads in a land that is otherwise devoid of firewood. But they rode down into the Zulu homestead where the mealies, the maize, were as high as a man's head. There was fresh ash in the fire, indicating the place was recently occupied, and a dog skulking around. And Louis Jean-Joseph insisted that they have coffee. And then one of the Zulus with them insisted that there were Zulus nearby. And Louis said, get the horses, prepare to leave. And when he gave the order, mount, having said, prepare to mount, where you've got your left foot in the stirrup, when he shouted mount, 30 Martini Henrys taken off dead men at Saint Luana opened up on the patrol. A trooper called Abel was shot dead. A man called Rogers couldn't get onto his horse and he ran around the back of a hut and was speared to death. And Louis was trying to get onto the back of Percy. Remember? Wone to buck and rear. He was bucked off. And as he flew off the horse, his great uncle's sword flew from the scabbard. But he was an able horseman and often used to vault into the saddle by grabbing the wallet strap behind the saddle and vaulting into the saddle. And as he did so, the wallet strap snapped, pitching him back in the dust. Well, Percy took off without him, and Louis grabbed his revolver and raced down a donga followed by Zulus. He faced them bravely. Apparently, when his revolver was empty, he pulled an assegai out of his thigh and continued to defend himself with his assegai. But he was eventually killed by Zulus. Can you imagine the moment when Carey pulls up about 825 yards from the spot and sees Percy come past with an empty saddle? And do you know, as they rode back towards their camp, they rode into two of South Africa's bravest war veterans, Brigadier General Sir Evelyn Wood, VC, and another called Redvers Buller, VC, who earned his VC at Kloban on the 28th of March, 1879. And Buller took a look at Carey and said, good God, what's the matter with you? He said, the Prince Imperial, he's dead. He said, where is he and where are your men? He said, they are behind me. And Buller then said, how many did you lose? And Carey said, I don't know. And Buller said, you ought to be shot. I could shoot you myself. And they looked down the valley with a telescope and they saw Zulus leading Percy with the empty saddle. Do you know the following day his body was recovered? More than 14 stab wounds to the front. The one that was surmised killed him was a great assegai thrust that entered the right eye and exited the back of his skull. His body was embalmed and returned to England for burial, eventually in Farnborough Abbey. And do you know that his beloved mother, who never recovered from her husband and then only child's death, came out for the anniversary the following year, 1st of June, 1880, and was taken to the spot where her son died. She had a candle for company, and it was a bitterly cold winter's night. And she asked for a sign that the soul of her boy knew she was there. And there was a rustle in the leaves at her feet, but no wind. And then the light of the candle turned 90 degrees to the candle for some seconds, had righted itself. She was satisfied. She went on to die aged 92, never having recovered from the death of her boy. And most of our listeners don't know that the Napoleonic dynasty effectively ended in a donga, in an ambush situation in the Itiotiosi Valley near Ngutu on the 1st of June of 1879. So let's talk about another incident involving a horse and things that go wrong. June 1966, Monty Labuskaghni, with his club down in a rather insalubrious part of Durban, he has a lot of gambling going on, pool tables, betting, and he's involved with a rather dishonest bookkeeper called Sonny Chislett. And one of the desperados around at that time was a man called Johnny Nell. And it's interesting that Chislett owed Labuskaghni a lot of money. And doing his book, he knew that if Sea Cottage won the Durban July that year, which he was destined to do, Chislett would lose a huge amount of money. And they hatched a plot between them to stop Sea Cottage. Labuskaghni saying if he did, he would waive the debt. And Johnny Nell, who was a desperado and a bouncer, was hired for a 10,000 rand hit in 1966 to disable, or rather to harm, Sea Cottage in some way that he never won the July. Now, this is the stuff of Dick Francis novels, so I did some research on it because I couldn't believe it. And he waited in a little concrete dugout at the Blue Lagoon Bridge for the horses to come down from Newmarket onto the beach for their morning workout and run, waited for Sea Cottage and shot him in the rump with a 7.65 pistol, basically a 3.2 pistol. But there were a number of issues that were very, very strange. He had a yellow Oldsmobile convertible, the only one in Durban that made him highly, highly identifiable. And that was his chosen getaway car. Well, he was arrested within hours. He was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. He was released after 3, very unwell on medical grounds. And he arrived at the home of one of Natal's great trainers who was intimately aware of what had happened, crying pitifully, saying he had nowhere to go. But he was dead within months of cancer, was Johnny Nell. Well, Sid Laird got Sea Cottage into a position to run fourth that year in the Durban July, prepared him for the Durban July the following year, where he managed to dead heat with Jollify. So the wonderful, wonderful breeders of Jollify and Sea Cottage have the very special honor of breeding 8 July winners in 7 years. Now, I've always thought that South Africa can easily breed horses equal to any other in the world. And I think that the success of thoroughbred breeding in this country, in Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, and other arenas, including Australia and the United States, has proven that this country can turn out horses as good as anywhere around the world. I love the fact, too, that along with the editorial help of Paul Duncan, this magnificent book has been produced for your enjoyment and also for the prosperity and the future of this wonderful, wonderful sport and vocation in our country. I was chatting to Vera Sutherland this week about Alan Sutherland. You know, at school he never played rugby. He was never destined to be a good rugby player. He ended up playing number 8 for the All Blacks. Was never destined to be a farmer. Ended up being a pretty good breeder of racehorses at Moy River at his stud, marrying Miss South Africa, Vera Johns. But I want to tell you, Alan Sutherland had a pretty short temper. He had a great sense of humor, but I'm glad you're laughing because he was known for a pretty short temper. And you didn't want to get the wrong side of him because he was a man mountain. And one morning he was telling his grooms and others to get mares ready to go to Scott Brothers to be covered. And he wasn't in a particularly good mood. And he came out of his office, jumped into his truck to which the trailer was attached, and took off with his grooms, his staff running down the road trying to stop him. And he never stopped. He took off to Scott Brothers, arrived there to find that the trailer was empty. None of his mares had been loaded. And I thought, you know, there comes time where there's a little bit of payback. It's just magnificent. And you know, because I work on the Anglo-Zulu War and the Anglo-Boer War, I'm always interested in those parts of our history. And isn't it wonderful to consider that the landlords who I mentioned earlier, including Jules Werner, Byte, Barney Bonato, Lionel Phillips, Abe Bailey. I don't know how many of you know anything about Lionel Phillips. He's the man who bought Vergelegen Wine Estate for his wife, Florence. He owned it from 1917 through to 1941. He's a man who walked out of the Rand Club in 1913 and was shot 5 times at point-blank range by a vagrant, Minson, in the chest. The bullets were so badly lodged, there was no chance of removing them, but he survived, but I think was never the same again physically. They developed Vergelegen in the most incredible manner. And I love the fact that thoroughbred breeding in this country and places like Vergelegen have largely been supported and carried by the wealth of the abundant resources in South Africa. But the landlords were the guys who planned the Jameson raid. They wanted to overthrow Kruger and his government in Pretoria and Johannesburg. And they became known as the Reform Committee. And Kruger was no fool. When they carried the demands to Kruger, he said, well, who are the Reform Committee? Do you know that he ended up getting them to give him all the names of the members on the Reform Committee who ended up being in court eventually and sentenced for treason? Now, for treason at that time, people were normally hung. And Kruger said, if we hang them, we're going to create martyrs out of them. And he commuted the sentences to fines. For the ringleaders, the landlords, £25,000. For the next ring, £12,000. For the Reform Committee and assistants, £2,000. And used those funds to arm the Boers for the impending Anglo-Boer War. But I love the fact that they delayed the big race in Johannesburg in December, or rather they delayed the plans that they were making on account of the big horse race, and it gave the Boers time to find out about the Jameson raid. December 1895, January 1896, and the Boers literally welcomed the British coming in under Leander Starr Jameson, captured them, and it turned into a very, very embarrassing public event in this country. And I think with all these things in mind, and I've been rambling on for some time, it's wonderful to see folks here, some that I recognize, some of whom I've known for many years. I'm delighted particularly to hear that you've had a really good sale today. We are here really to celebrate 100 years of thoroughbred breeding in South Africa, which officially was in 2020, right in the middle of COVID. TBA began in 1920, and here we are in 2023 on account of COVID, celebrating this momentous occasion, which each and every one of you should be very, very proud of. So I thank you for your ear here this evening. I thank you for a unique opportunity to come and chat to you about some various little tidbits and anecdotes of South African and indeed thoroughbred history. And I'd like to take this opportunity of wishing you, each and every one of you, all the very best in the days ahead. May your hopes and dreams be exceeded. Thank you for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's have another big round of applause for Rob Caskey. Rob, thank you very much.